put it this way. I was carrying on a regular teaching program all this while during the war. So I was teaching an instrumentation course, the measurements course for the engineers. I was helping Dr. Pender with his course, which he gave to the seniors on how to use matrix calculations for power transmission and power machinery and so forth. And whatever I was doing, I had to teach one course to the student from the Army or the Navy, and then I had another one for maybe the civilians there and so on. So I had what they considered a full teaching schedule. I had to be around to help people in the measurements laboratory, just as Press had been around to help us when I first came to the Moore School that summer. And all of those things were going on, and give quizzes and mark papers, what you normally expect in engineering teaching. So when did I have any time to find out what was going on in the computer? Mainly by waiting until after all this teaching was out of the way and getting a dinner somehow, either going home or down at Linton's or someplace, getting something to eat and coming back, and Press would still be working there as he'd been in the daytime, and he and I then would find out what was going on there, and we'd have our opportunities to design something better. In other words, all the ideas that went into what was later called the EDVAC were thought about while we were looking at the ENIAC taking shape and were saying, gee, that's an awkward way to do that, why can't we, and so forth. And what was most awkward was the way the programming was done, and the whole thing just sort of unfolded before us as how simple it would be if we had more storage, if we could represent all these different kinds of storage in one place under the same mechanism of storage. That meant the programming, the function tables, the counting of number of operations done, because we had special counters in each panel to say if you wanted to multiply by 10, why all you had to do was shift, and that was what Kay was talking about a minute ago. You know, that if you wanted to multiply by 5,000, why you just had to essentially have a counter set so that it would add 5 times, where they already had the 5 there, and all they had to do was shift it over so it's in the place where it represented 1,000. So with all the shifting and all the other things, these are all special ways of getting things done, which were the simplest ways at the time. And we thought of all the ways that we could manage this with a simpler computer. And we also thought about the fact that a computer which was doing everything one at a time, serially, would of course require less equipment, and therefore, although it might not be as fast, it would be a lot cheaper to build and a lot less complications, and maybe take up less room and have easier service problems because there'd be less vacuum tubes involved.
Okay, now let me interrupt so I can finish up with Kay. Okay, now let's see. The other thing is, you weren't really too didn't see much or were aware of the excitement or what was going on. Did you kind of know something interesting was being?
Well,
were there rumors going around? That's what I was.
We knew that there was a big project going on at the Moore School. The whole back section of the first floor was devoted to this construction project that was going on there, and they not only that, but when Fran and I first came to Moore School, with the exception of the girls, I think there were about 4 of them who had been sent up from Aberdeen, and Dean Pender's secretary, there were no women in the Moore School at all. But gradually, as the project of the ENIAC construction went on, Moore School hired more and more women. So it was very obvious that there were very, very many more women, and they were working at well, the wiring jobs that were going on. And I don't know where they had recruited the girls from, but they weren't all college graduates or anything like that. But it did fill up Moore School pretty much, and they would tell us that they were working on this project. We never did get in to see it in the actual construction phases that I know of.
Secret, I guess. Now, would you want to then sort of tell about what year you were married and names of your children? I think it'd be nice to.
Oh, well, would you like to hear about the when the machine was finally constructed?
Yeah, I'd love to hear that. Yeah.
Oh, well, Fran Bielis and I worked on opposite shifts all during the war, and toward the spring of 1945, it became pretty obvious that the war was ending, and I can't remember exactly whether it was Goldstein, Lieutenant Goldstein, or John Holbert, who came to me one day while I was working on my shift and asked if I would be at all interested in working on the new computer that was being constructed upstairs. So with nothing else looming big in my future at that time, I said I thought that'd be interesting to learn how to do that. And so evidently they had approached about 6 girls who were working in the unit at the time and asked them if they'd be interested in learning this. So there were 6 of us chosen from those who decided they would like to, and we were sent around the first week in June, I suppose, to Aberdeen for a 3-month study of how to operate all the different computing machines that were down there. That is the IBM type card handling machines, because we weren't at all familiar with that type of operation. And so we went down there and we learned how to wire up tabulator boards and how to wire up their automatic relay multipliers, which they had down there. And you want to stop there?
No, well, you would keep on and I'll tell
Oh, okay.
Would you be willing to bring Max in, or because he's barking at the window?
Yeah. Well, we spent, the 6 of us spent the summer in Aberdeen learning how to operate all the IBM machines. And the reason for this was that the input and the output of the ENIAC was going to be by way of IBM machines. So if we were going to operate the machine, the people in charge figured that we would have to know how to work IBM cards. Well, when we came back that fall this is now in the fall of 1945, the ENIAC was already pretty much constructed. As a matter of fact, all the panels were up. Some of the parts were not quite finished. I think the multiplier dividers, the divider square rooter was not in operation, but otherwise everything else was. And then we were told we had to learn how to operate this machine. Well, how do you go about that? And they, whoever, I guess was somebody from Moore School, I just don't remember just who the person was, gave us a whole stack of blueprints. And these were the wiring diagrams for all the panels. And they said, here, you can figure out how the machine works and then figure out how to program it. Well, this was a little bit hard to do, knowing nothing about anything. So Dr. Burks at that time was one of the people assigned to explain to us how the various parts of the computer worked, how an accumulator worked. Well, once you knew how an accumulator worked, you could pretty well be able to trace the other circuits for yourself and figure this thing out. So we then proceeded to program a trajectory to go onto this machine. And we had barely begun to think that we had enough knowledge of the machine to program a trajectory when we were told that 2 people were coming from Los Alamos to put a problem on the machine, and Fran and I were asked to help these 2 people from Los Alamos to put their problem on the machine. Well, as I understood, I didn't understand it too well at that time, but now I know from things I've learned later that that was Nick Metropolis and Stan Frankel, both from Los Alamos Laboratory, had already been to the Moore School in July at the invitation of Captain Goldstein, and they had worked with Captain and Mrs. Goldstein and had gotten the general idea of how the ENIAC was going to work, and They had programmed their problem, which was supposed to be a top secret problem, and then they had left, gone back to Los Alamos. When they appeared again in about October, I think it was, they had the problem pretty much programmed onto sheets of paper, and we were to help them set up the machine for this. And that was our first real time on the computer itself. We went downstairs into that room, and that was when all the fun began, because no one knew how many bad joints there were and how many bad tubes there were and so on until we actually started testing the machine. Well, John and Press at that time were like mother hens. Oh, they were mother hens, of course they were. They stayed with that computer night and day. And whatever went wrong, they were in there. There were a couple engineers assigned to it to do the work, but they just were completely involved in every aspect of that operation of the computer, not in the problem itself. I'm not even sure that they were told what the problem was, because it was supposedly a top secret problem, but they certainly knew and wanted to know what each little single part of that computer was going to do. And so Fran and I worked. Sometimes I would come in the morning at 7:45 and work until 5 or 6 or 7, and Fran would come in for the evening shift, and she would sometimes work up till 3 a.m. and then on alternate weeks the reverse would happen. So we got to know everybody attached to the Moore School, to the ENIAC project very, very well. And then along Nick and Stan's project, their problem went on in November and December, I think. And then during January, we heard that there was going to be a public demonstration of the ENIAC. And Captain and Mrs. Goldstein were in charge of this public demonstration. So they picked Betty Bardick to work with them in, maybe Betty Holbert, but I'm not quite sure about that, to work with them in working up some demonstration problems. And that demonstration took place in February and was highly successful. It was very good. Well, shortly after that, I think Nick Metropolis came back to work again on his problem, and this time with him came Tony Turkovich from the University of Chicago. And they worked for a few weeks. And they had no sooner left when Dr. Hartree came from England, and I was assigned to work with Dr. Hartree. So Dr. Hartree had been here once before and had had the operation of the machine explained to him, and he had also had evidently some blueprints or some description of the machine before he arrived to put his problem on. So I went over, worked with him, and ironed the bugs out of the setup that he had worked out, and together we set up the machine and started to work Dr. Hartree's problem. And that went on most of the month of July of 1946, we're talking about now. So I had a lot of fun working on that machine. Just absolutely wonderful time. So that fall, when the machine was moved to Aberdeen, I went to Aberdeen with the machine. And I wasn't down there very long when I found out that the mother hen was anxious to see how that machine was getting along. So John would come down to see how they were getting along on that machine. And I think it was in Aberdeen that the first idea of establishing the Computer Society, the Society of Computing Machinery, was, at least they had a meeting down there while I was there. I think that was in 1947.
Well, the first occasion that I remember when we talked about having a computer society was when Ed Berkeley and others somehow got together a group at Columbia University, I believe.
Oh.
And maybe 100 or more people came up there, said we're going to form a society, and there was quite a lot of discussion as to what to call it. And originally it was called the Eastern Association because there were mostly Easterners there, and we didn't want to presume to represent the whole country if the other people wanted something different, why, we'd find that out later. So it was the Eastern Association for Computing Machinery. But at any rate, as a result of that original organization and a lot more work, I'm sure, by Berkeley and others, why, the first actual meeting with papers and everything presented as an ACM meeting was the meeting at Aberdeen.
And what year was that? Or can you remember? Wasn't that in 47? It must have been
Probably
in 47
was, but,
because we got married
yes.
in 48.
Mm-hmm. And the second meeting, I believe, was at Oak Ridge. And my remembrance of that meeting was mostly because you had to get there by train, and it was quite a ride down to Knoxville or someplace, and getting over by bus, I believe, to Oak Ridge, and all of that. And so what did we have when we got there? Why, the most interesting thing was a fellow named Herb Grosch, an astronomer who worked with Wallace Eckert at Columbia University, was here taking IBM to task for some of the things they didn't do. And this turned out to be the flavor of that man Grosch. All through his life, he was always criticizing his employers.
Well, let's see. Now, I think it might be interesting if, I don't know, for instance, whether all your children were born while you were in this house, or did you live somewhere else and then move here?
Well, when I first married John, and that was, he said, a great emergency. His mother was sick. His wife had previously died 2 years before that, and his mother was not well. His children didn't have anybody much looking after them. And the housekeeper that he had hired to look after the children was about to have a baby, and she was going to leave. And, oh, he had so many compelling reasons why we should get married. And so, anyway, we did.
You had none, of course.
Well, I don't know. I felt that there were so many women then that were looking for a husband just to have somebody look after them, and I felt that here was a man I really loved. I may as well marry him. That was a good reason.
Any children?
So our first baby was born the next year, in 1949. And then 2 years later, our second, which was Kathy, in 51. And then 2 years later, our one and only son, our first and only son, Bill, we call him, he is John William Jr., was born in 53. And Jeannie was born in 54. And then 5 years later was born our youngest, Eva, who is now a freshman in college. So we've had that, between the two of us, we've had 7 children.
Yes. The two I'd had previously were both born in Collegeville, where I was at Ursinus College. And so my oldest boy is 42 and lives in New Hampshire and is now an artist, although he has been in the computer industry before. And
His name is?
That's James. I started out by saying we don't want any juniors, you know, that's somewhat second grade. Nobody should be called junior. And so I wasn't going to name anybody after me. And the second one turned out to be a girl, so I wasn't going to name her after me. But the rest of the 5 children that Kay just talked about, we decided maybe if we were fortunate to have another boy, why, maybe we should give him a junior, which we did.
Did you mention your second daughter's name? And what was
Sydney.
Kathy?
Oh.
No.
My second daughter named Sydney, yes. Yes.
And I was wondering if you mentioned your first child.
Sally, yes.
Sally.
Sally is the oldest
Yes.
of our 5. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But shortly after we got married, at the time we got married, we were living in West Philadelphia because John had bought a house out there while he was teaching at the university.
You had to live close to the university so you could walk.
I was thinking you might mention about a little bit about the wedding, how Press was your best man, and maybe a little bit about your sister marrying a Moore School professor. You were all kind of, I think that might be kind of nice to have in there. Could you fit that in a little bit? I like that sort of. Do you want to mention Press was your best man?
Well, I couldn't mention that, but I just...
Or do you want to mention Celia and Josh?
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah.
Because I think we might be interviewing Josh later, so it'd be kind of nice to...
Well, one of the things that was interesting about the romances of the McNulty girls, I had 2 younger sisters, was that both of my sisters got engaged before I had decided to marry John. So to keep tradition the way it should be, I had a quick hurry up and get married to John before my sisters got married. So my second sister, Anna, got married. I got married in February. My second sister got married in August. And my youngest sister, Cecilia, had gotten engaged to Josh Gray, who was a professor at the Moore School. He was a student working for his doctor's degree at that time. So we've been quite close to the Moore School ever since. Oh, yes. During the war, Josh was one of the Navy boys. He used to come down to the differential analyzer room to cool off in that air conditioning every morning. So after the war was over, he came back to work for his doctor's degree. And he and I got to know each other, and I took him out to the house, and he met my sister.
That's good. Now, Jim, you think of anything else we should cover? You think of anything else you'd like to put in? Covered pretty well what... unless you have any anecdotes you want to tell about press and yourselves, anything?
Yeah.
You never told about the wedding?
I didn't say about the wedding. Oh, yeah, that's right. Oh,
if you'd like to, I mean, that's up to you. Whatever.
Well, when this is a little touchy subject. You're going to. It's on the tape, but I just wanted it on the aside. Was that my parents did not like the idea of my marrying John at all.
I was too old for her.
There were many
Besides,
complications, and the religion, yeah, was a difference, and
everything
so on.
was wrong.
Everything was wrong, so they were not about to either give me a wedding or even come to the wedding. So my sister was my bridesmaid, and Press Eckert was our best man at our wedding.
That's good. You know what? It's so working because we want to really establish, of course, that you're the first.
Yes.
That how important you are to UNIVAC.
Yes. Well, I was going to say that up to now we really haven't said much at all.
Right. So
And
now's a chance
to sort of sketch that in
right.
somehow. Yes. So. So tell me when.
The cup will be colorful. Okay.
Well, I got to the fact that Russ and I decided to go into business, and we got the indication from the Census Bureau that they would be interested in a product which we then called EDVAC 2, because everybody was talking about EDVAC, but nobody had any idea what a computing machine was like, except to resemble something that resembled that. But after a while, we decided on a name and called it UNIVAC. And the Universal Automatic Computer became the main product of this new company, which started out in life as an electronic control company and then switched over to be a stock company known as Esther Carr Computer Corporation. Well, I won't worry you about the how we had to get financing so we would live through to see today, but we did have several efforts at financing, including the American Totalizator Company, and finally we became part of the Remington Rand organization. By that time we had already secured 3 contracts for UNIVAC through the Bureau of Standards, who were then set up as the agency to procure new computers of this electronic breed for the government. And we got not only a contract then for Census, but for the Army Map Service and also the Air Controller's Office in the Pentagon. There were 3 UNIVACs to be built, and nobody really put a time limit on how fast that had to be. Rather, they put a cautious requirement in there that first we had to prove to them that we knew how to build a UNIVAC before they'd give us the whole contract. Well, we therefore had to write a report and get the report approved by a committee from the National Research Council. And it was a little peculiar to us, the fact that the National Research Council, who had to judge whether we had a better design than the Moore School had, or that Raytheon had, because they were also induced to be a third contractor to help to make the thing more competitive and free them from the single source problem. The thing that was peculiar was the members of that committee were all on other sides of the fence, you might say. We had an analog man from MIT, Sam Caldwell, on that committee. We had Goldstein, I mean not Goldstein, but Von Neumann from Institute for Advanced Study on that committee, who had his own ideas as to how to build a computer. And we had Aiken on that committee, I guess. At any rate, 4 or 5 people, none of whom were particularly interested in seeing the kind of computer that we thought ought to be built for business, commercial, and universal purposes. Some of them thought in scientific terms, some of them thought in analog terms, and so on. Well, the Bureau of Standards itself, John Curtis and the others in their new Division 11, were first dismayed, as we were, that that committee didn't meet as soon as it could to consider our reports and say what to do next. Then when it did meet, they were further dismayed because the committee told them, don't buy anything. It's not ready yet. You should be very cautious about all this. And maybe you ought to give a contract to somebody for memory and somebody else for arithmetic and somebody else for output and so on. Well, this was counter, of course, to the whole mandate given the Bureau. They'd been given money to procure a computer, not to do more experimentation. So they finally got down to it and they said, we'll buy one. We'll buy 3, in fact, from the Kay Mauchly people, and we'll give a contract to Raytheon to build one for the Navy and so on. Well, that's the way that happened in brief. But the thing is that subsequently, of course, having survived also the financing problem, why we did produce a lot more. There were 40 or 50 UNIVAC 1, so-called, and then another slice of them, a big bunch that were built with a magnetic core memory, such as MIT had developed under Forrester. And with all of that, many, many UNIVACs were built, and many, many people knew the word UNIVAC. And partly because of an idea which was developed when Rand backed us, that perhaps we could forecast elections with UNIVACs. And so I knew somebody, another statistician, whom I thought could help to do that. And so Max Woodbury and I and some others worked together, and we made a name for UNIVAC in the election forecasting business. That's such a long and interesting story that I'd better skip it right now. But in the meantime, why, the thought of most people was that Remington Rand was far ahead in this competition. No one, IBM or anyone, had anything that would compare with what we were offering. We had visitors from all over, from Sweden, offering us a contract. Buy a computer for Sweden. The State Department said, no, it's an article of munitions. We can't export one. You cannot sell anything like that. So there were various impediments put in our way so that we couldn't just grow with more business from a foreign source. So we had to subsist the best way we did, and I won't try to describe all of that. But I think that what is more remarkable is that the way that things have progressed in the 25 years or more since the time that we delivered that first computer to the Census Bureau. We had to, as they say, hold their hands quite a lot during that time, not only to first persuade them that this is the way we want to build this computer, and that's the way you'd like to have it, I'm sure. But how do you use the computer? And how do you decide that what you're getting is what you want? So one of the most remarkable things I think about that first UNIVAC computer was, at the time of delivery, Joe Daly and other statisticians came up from the Census Bureau with a new form of testing which had been developed during the war by Abraham Wald up at Columbia, sequential testing, where if you were on the borderline, then you had to run the test longer. If you went through nicely, why, then the test was short. But every time, if there was a failure, then you didn't just immediately say it's no good, but you tested longer and longer to see for sure, is this making more mistakes than it should or less? Well, fortunately, with that sequential method of testing, we felt that we were adequately and fairly tested, and we had the most wonderful history of compliance with requirements that anybody could have. Unfortunately, Remington Rand never appreciated that or advertised it. They just waited a couple of years before they even said they had a UNIVAC to sell. But that's another story, too. They blew their lead, you might say, in the beginning there. And what happened? IBM came up and developed and passed them in the computer business in the electronic field. But as of today, why, I have two things that I want to comment on here. One is that just last year, July '76, the Census Bureau had a celebration. It's just exactly 25 years since they had received the first UNIVAC. And at that time, they gave me, and others like Eckert, many of the workers at the Census Bureau received similar mementos of their work. I was given a reel of magnetic tape with a little plaque on saying that this was the 25th anniversary of that. Now, this is a heavy thing to lift, incidentally, and it reminds me to mention, you see, that not only did we think that magnetic tape was the way to go as far as fast input and output and flexibility for a computer, but there wasn't any magnetic tape that was useful that way. They were just beginning to make magnetic tape, and they put it on cellophane surface, and the cellophane would snap and crack and brittle and so forth. So one of the things that the Esther Mauchly Computer Company did was to go into the whole new field of developing a suitable magnetic tape. This is heavy because it's on metal base, phosphor bronze. We had to go into how do you get phosphor bronze of the right thickness and the right width with edges that were not rough and so on. The slitting mills, as they call it. How do you get it? And what do you do with phosphor bronze after you get it? We went to the Bureau of Standards, and my old Sunday school teacher, Dr. William Blum, who until recently was one of the oldest alumni of the University of Pennsylvania, still living, but he just died, so Dr. Blum, the electrochemist of the Bureau of Standards, told Ted Bond of our engineering staff what to do and how to go about it to try to get cobalt and other materials plated through a continuous plating bath so that we could have a continuous process producing this kind of tape. Well, that was itself a pretty damn significant achievement, regardless of what was said and what was done about how to build electronic computers. At that Moore School lecture in 1946, we couldn't have told anybody how to make magnetic tape. We didn't know. We had to do the research. And fortunately, it turned out well. We had other people like an aircraft graduate. There's a man in aeronautical engineering graduate, Fraser Welch, who worked with Press and me to develop the means for handling such things, starting it, stopping it, reading it. Nothing like that had ever been done before either. Well, the other memento I have here is a replica of the first nameplate of the UNIVAC that was delivered to the census. And model number 10P355, serial number 1. There it is. So now this is just a paperweight, you might say, but it bears the date 3/30/51. The 30th of March, 1951, which is just 5 years, I guess, after we left the Moore School. Well, it's often been said it takes about 5 years for a product to go from its research and initial phases into commercial production, and there it is. 5 years after we had thought that we could produce a commercial computer and produce tapes with it, why, we came out and delivered the first UNIVAC for commercial operation. And we made it pretty clear, I think, through the demonstrations at that time and the uses and the customers that we had and so forth, that it was a fairly universal computer and that it was general purpose. It did all the sorting for the Census Bureau. It did all the computations of statistics for them. It did all kinds of complicated operations for the Army Map Service, transforming one map into another for military uses all over the world. At the Air Force, they were doing a special kind of mathematics, mini-max programming, they called it. And that was an important development, you might say, in the field of mathematics in those days. The other thing that I wanted to comment on here is that right here in my hand, I hold the computing capacity which is more than equivalent to the ENIAC and practically equivalent to the UNIVAC. It doesn't have quite as much memory within itself, but it stores a program of 200 and some steps. And it has a magnetic means, which I won't demonstrate here, but a little slot here through which you can feed a card with magnetic coding. And you can read off data, read on data. You can store programs and regenerate, renew those programs stored internally here through use of these cards. And it works to a 10-digit accuracy, just like 10 decimal digits, just like the ENIAC. And it has a number of other features which we could say are make it in some senses much superior to the ENIAC. It doesn't work as fast, however. But what can you expect? The most important phenomenon about this kind of development in the electronic industries in the last 10 years has been the fact that we have not only produced such a micro size, we've reduced everything to the point where I can hold it in my hand, but we reduced to the point where at our sinus, out of my salary, I could have bought one. In fact, the phenomenon is that this came out a few years ago for like $400. It has been cut in price and cut in price, and now you can buy them for a little over $100, including magnetic recording, including all kinds of features here which I would have longed for in the old days. And that is a history which we're just in midstream of. We don't know what's going to happen next, you might say. It's hard to prophesy with the possibilities which this amount of development has taken us to in 25 years, what the next 25 or less years are going to bring about. They have magnetic bubble memories now, where in a cubic inch you can store hundreds of millions of digits or something of that character, that size. And the transistors which the telephone company brought out of their research laboratory have become these miniature things we're talking about. Now the bubbles, the magnetic bubbles of the Bell Telephone Laboratories are not only going to help the telephone company, they're going to help everybody who has anything in the way of data to store and data to use. And that's the great history, you might say, in the making. We're in midstream, as I say. So it's nice, incidentally, to have been given a doctor's degree, Doctor of Science degree from Ursinus College just this year. And to have had the census people, for instance, celebrate with us that 25th anniversary of that first commercial computer And we have lots of, I might say, tokens of our accomplishment. But what really counts is what's going to be accomplished next. Did we get within the time?
Could you tell me whether you are surprised by this, or you think you...
Surprised by what?
By the fact that it's come in 25 years, it is to such a small size. Do you think did you envision that at all happening?
Oh, I see. Did this surprise me? I thought you were pointing to the...
Did you ever think this would happen in your lifetime?
Not really. The general answer I have to questions similar to that are, did they say, do you think the computer industry would have, and so forth? And I say, yeah, I always thought it would. What surprised me was how long it took. Now, I can't really say that about the miniaturization. I didn't even, for a moment, think about that miniaturization. I was just reading the other night a thing I brought up, my 25th, or what it was, I guess it was the 50th anniversary of the Chemical Society. I was out in Chicago helping them celebrate their golden anniversary or something. And the talk I gave was called Prologue to Automation, I think. And what I was telling them there was that in addition to these things helping the engineer, for instance, and the scientist, and testing out things and doing a lot of things which most people understand as mathematical in nature. Sure, you must need a computer to do that. That there are all of these non-mathematical types of things a computer does, which are becoming more and more important in our industry and our science and our life, that we need what we call information retrieval to be done by computers, because, as the American Chemical Society noted long ago when they were trying to index and catalog and abstract the chemical literature, the volumes grew and grew about exponentially. Even when we were in Paris in 1959 talking about information retrieval, they were aware that that was happening to the chemical abstracts, that they needed a 10-foot shelf instead of 2 volumes or something to tell everything that happened in chemistry that year. And by tell, I mean, you know, having just a little sliver of the title of an article and where to find it, and maybe a little bit about what's the article about. To do all that, it just took volumes, bigger than an encyclopedia, bigger than Britannica or the Americana or any of those things. It took more than that just to tell what was going on in one branch of science, chemistry. Well, all branches of science are getting more complicated. I dare say it takes a lot right now to tell what the geneticists are doing with their RNAs and DNAs and all the experiments they can do. I just read the other day, or heard on the radio, that a man is going to modify some bacteria so that it will generate human insulin. The diabetics of today are still dependent on insulin shots that come from hogs, or animal-derived. It isn't quite the same, and they develop allergic reactions, some humans do, to the insulin that comes from the hog. But they're going to be able to set this bacteria to work in a mass production on insulin. And there are all kinds of things which, well, one of the things that we've been very interested in the last few years, of course, is the CAT, the computer-assisted tachistics or whatever, the medical instruments which now can, by little flashes of X-rays, for instance, from a moving camera, can develop three-dimensional pictures and slices, you might say, of what's inside of you without giving you too much of a dose of X-rays while they're doing it either. And that's all done by incorporating a computer in the instrument which does all this. The instrument costs a lot, which is one of the reasons why we see medical expenses increasing. Everybody thinks that they've got to have these nice new things. But perhaps by time sharing, they can share some of these instruments, just as many people in the computer world time share their computers. Why, maybe we can keep the costs from skyrocketing. But whatever we do, we have this problem of not only finding out things, developing information, but then not losing the information, somehow filing it so that it can be retrieved again and made useful to somebody. People have estimated, for instance, that some of the drug research people, I mean to say pharmaceutical companies, not just dope, that these pharmaceutical companies sometimes have to perform an experiment all over again because they don't know how to locate something that was in a lab notebook 10 years ago, which apparently would have told them, but except that they've lost the record. You know, they don't know how to get at it. And that's the way it is, not only with pharmaceutical companies, obviously, but with all kinds of things in this country. I often wonder about the educational process. And we have more and more research on how to teach and what's the learning process. And a lot of that information is probably never properly correlated, and it gets lost. So the taxpayers' money, if you wish, has been essentially wasted by not getting the most out of the information that we've already developed. And that's why I think there's a great future ahead for a lot of things which have nothing to do with number crunching, as some people call it. Nothing to do necessarily with how do you multiply and divide, and how do you do the higher mathematics in any way, shape, or form, but rather, how do you keep track of information and make it available? What did you ask?
Anything you can think of that I've left out, or we've left out?
I'm sure there is, but I'm not.
Yeah, I'm sure we've left out.
We'll think of many things. So,
anything you want to add?
what we need now is just a good note taker so that you come back sometime and we
What we have to
polish up fill in the cracks, you might say.
Transcribe this.
Yes.
Who impressed you most, John, of all the people you met in those early days?
Well, I guess different people impressed me in different ways. As I said somewhere in the last few days, Dr. Pender impressed me very much. And I had occasion, I think, to say so when I went down to the 100th anniversary of Hopkins to realize that here I was, a graduate of Hopkins who came to Hopkins on the 50th anniversary, 1925, or 26 actually. And Roland was already dead, but I worked under a professor named Wood, who had worked under Roland, and who took over this grading production, you know, making the spectroscopic gratings. And then, as we went on, I finally wound up being hired by and working for Harold Pender, who was one of the first guys to work under Roland and got his degree there. I wound up at the Moore School with that man. Well, Pender impressed me quite a bit at that time. But in other ways, who impressed me in other ways? Well, in a certain way, I was impressed certainly by von Neumann when I met him. That guy was a genius, and he deserved many of the things which have been credited to him and said to him. His only fault seemed to be that he never disclaimed anything. If somebody said, didn't what Johnny von Neumann do, wasn't that wonderful? Why, he never said, oh, you shouldn't be crediting me with that. That was the work of so-and-so. He took every credit that was possibly offered to him, apparently. But he was a genius, nevertheless. I used to like to listen to his humor. He always had stories that were appropriate for a thing, and maybe better than Abe Lincoln, who was a great storyteller, I understand. So, do you want to narrow the question? Who impressed me most of the Moore School faculty, or what?
Well, anybody in particular for any purpose?
Well, at the moment, incidentally, at the time, I was impressed in my own way, you might say, in a peculiar way then, by Carl Chambers. It seemed to me that for a young man who had just shortly graduated from Dickinson College as a football man, I understand, to have become a director of research for International Resistance Company, which was Dr. Pender's initial venture, I guess, into the commercial world. For him to do that and know and do all the other things that I could learn from his conversation, that he was quite a up-and-coming gentleman. And it was he who commented to me, you know, as he was trying to get me a job somewhere, why, he said, within a few weeks, you know, you and I are the same age. I said, yes? He said, yes. My birthday and my year of birth and everything is very close to yours. There's no reason, he said, why you can't be making as much money as I make. Well, maybe that's a crass commercial approach, but I think it was a well-meant comment that I had been earning very little money out at the Ursinus College, and it didn't seem as if I was going to make much more at the university because as an instructor they weren't going to pay me anymore. But they were indicating that there were opportunities through consulting contracts to make more. And indeed it turned out that I did make some more money through some consultation work, which more or less came from other professors' contacts and so forth. I worked on the efficiency of a certain kind of fluorescent lighting system and so on. Well, all the while that fluorescent lighting system was having its efficiency measured, why, that little binary counter was going blip, 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 blip. The same thing that Press Eckert and others remember seeing in my office. And that was the only symbol I had that I was interested in computers until we actually got that contract from Goldstein.
Did you ever say anything about that Lost Memo that I read about in the book?
Yeah, he did.
Yes, what I didn't mention, but which I guess should be mentioned nowadays, is that it's in everybody's library, or anybody that has a library that includes Brian Randall's book on the origin of digital computers. He made it a point to get a hold of that. I don't think he reproduced all of the material that would have been useful and interesting. He could have gotten more, I think, out of the actual proposal to Aberdeen, which showed my diagrams on how you would set up an ENIAC so it would do this step-by-step integration for the firing tables. I had to do that before we even got the contract. So I'd done a considerable amount of thinking and working on this numerical integration stuff in advance of our getting that contract. But you can also find in that Origin of Digital Computers another extract or part of what von Neumann wrote about the logical organization of computers. And you can also find a proposal whereby Adnassov hoped to get some grant money to help his project out at Ames, Iowa. But since he never even told the patent attorneys how he intended to design the machine, well, of course, he never got a patent. And he didn't get much in the way of grants.
Who affected you the most? To whom, of all your teachers or all your mentors and so forth, you feel really gave you momentum?
Well, I think there's no question about that, but Press Eckert did. He was a kind of a teacher. That is, he showed me a lot of things about the engineering design and reliability problems and so forth, which, although I knew such problems existed, I never myself had any conscious way of dealing with them, you might say. And of course, you don't need all of that machinery of how do you manage to get that reliability with working with a team. You don't need that if you were the only one. You may maybe solve a lot of problems without ever consciously knowing what you did. But with a team, you've got to get them all on the beam and working together. And he did that. And he did a very wonderful job of that. But of course, even before he did that, why, the fact that he could respond to my ideas and my questions by saying, well, he didn't see anything in the way, what obstacles could there be, indicates a very different attitude than those who said, oh, there'd be so many tubes, it wouldn't work, which is a very vague, wet blanket. So I'd say that he was by far away the most influential person, as far as I'm concerned, in the actual history of anything having to do with computing and the computer devices.
What about before you, when you were at Earth Science, and even before, who gave you ideas or set things up in that direction?
Well, nobody consciously set me up in that direction. I was, you might say, at one time, the most important thing to me was a book which went through 7 or 8 editions, maybe more by this time, when I first learned about Ronald A. Fisher, the agricultural statistician in England. And I started reading whatever it was, edition 5 or 6 or something was available then, and I've since published subsequent editions. The switch over to me from regarding statistics as a descriptive tool, which essentially it was to me and to lots of other people as it was taught and used in the days that I was teaching the students in the physics laboratory, for instance, at Hopkins. Why, what was statistics all about? Why, it was merely some way of computing something, what you call the standard deviation, and putting that with some factor down as being the probable error of this measurement is plus or minus so much. And all of statistics seemed to be about that, except that there were, of course, something about finding relationships by correlation. And one of the things I did in the days at Hopkins was I wandered around the dormitory and visited several people. One of them was at that time the junior chess champion or something in New York City. And I soon found out that I couldn't match him at chess. He tried to show me how, but he couldn't. But I found out how to match him by I learned the game of Nim. And that was something he couldn't fathom. He didn't have any construct, any picture of the abstract theory of that game, whereas he knew all about chess, it seemed. Well, one of the things he had in his room was a book by Mills on economic statistics or business statistics or something. I still have the volume somewhere here. I went and bought one of those secondhand then as soon as I realized. I spent one whole evening reading the whole damn book, and found out that people in business statistics seem to be spending an awful lot of time learning the difference between a median and a mode. And that then at the very last chapter you got the pièce de résistance. You learned how to compute a product moment correlation, which name was attributed to Pearson. And so that of course keyed me in at maybe Pearson was a great guy. Maybe you ought to pay more attention. And later, of course, I've got some of the tables that were produced. There were 2 Pearsons, a father and son, I believe. And so all of these statisticians seem to derive their motivations and inspiration and the utility of use for their work from biology and biological sciences and things of that sort. The physicists had no use for statistics except for the Maxwellian type, you know, describing the properties of a gas and things of that sort. So I didn't know anything about statistics, really. I was a babe in the woods when I came out of graduate school. When I first found out about R.A. Fisher, and the fact that you could use this inductively to see whether or not a given hypothesis was likely to be true or unlikely to be true, that was a real awakening. And that didn't come until after I'd spent a few years communing with Harold Hotelling and other people up at Columbia and various other statisticians. That session, you might say, with the statisticians was a very interesting one. When I got in with that crowd, you might say, and started going to the meetings, Hotelling said, if you're interested in this sort of thing, you know, after he described to me a paper he'd just written and how I might use it was obvious to me. After he described that, he said, if you're interested in this sort of thing, you ought to join the Institute for Mathematical Statistics. So I didn't know there was one. And so he said, come around, you know, we're having a meeting next week or something. So I did. And I met so many people whose names have turned up more recently, of course. For instance, as a Friedman, the statistician at the University of Chicago, occasionally writes in the Newsweek, for instance, Milton Friedman. And Kullback, who was with the Army Security Agency, for instance, who was ostensibly a teacher at George Washington University, but who was actually using that as cover for the fact that he was a statistician working with Friedman, the cryptographer at Security Agency. Lots of other people. And interesting to me was the fact that when I finally went